January 17th, 1943. A frozen dawn over northern France. The mist clung low across the airfield at Leeuwarden, turning the hangars into gray silhouettes. A strange aircraft sat in the middle of the tarmac, a beast of dull silver. Its wings holed, its nose blackened, its engine still ticking with the slow, dying crackle of heat. It was a Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress. American markings had been hastily painted over with crude black crosses. Its glass nose was shattered. The smell of burned oil and cordite hung inside the fuselage. German ground crews moved around it cautiously, as if it might start firing on its own. 3 Luftwaffe officers approached. Their breath smoked in the air. The youngest, Oberleutnant Karl Drexler, stopped at the left waist gunner's window and stared. Inside were 10 50 caliber guns, twin mounts, rotating turrets, power-driven sights, all designed for one purpose: to shred attackers before they got close. Drexler exhaled slowly. "I've never seen firepower like this," he whispered, and that astonishment would mark the beginning of one of the strangest studies of the air war. In early 1943, the skies over Europe had become a crucible. The Allied strategy of daylight bombing, led by the 8th Air Force, was now in full perilous swing. From bases across England, silver formations of B-17 flying fortresses rose daily into the cold northern winds, bound for the industrial heart of the Third Reich. Their targets were precise: U-boat pens, aircraft factories, oil refineries, and ball-bearing plants. But precision came at a cost. Unlike the British, who bombed by night, the Americans believed daylight attacks would cripple Germany's war machine faster. Accuracy demanded sunlight. It also demanded courage. The Luftwaffe still ruled the daylight sky. By January, the 91st Bomb Group was flying deep penetration raids across France and the Low Countries. The formations stretched for miles, square upon square of gleaming aircraft, each bristling with guns. Pilots trusted the myth of the flying fortress: 10 men to a ship, 13 defensive guns, thick armor plating. It was said a B-17 could fly home on 3 engines, or even 2. But the enemy adapted quickly. Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s now rose in packs, attacking from above and head-on, the one blind spot the B-17's overlapping arcs of fire couldn't cover. Even the bravest gunners could only sweep the sky so fast. Bombers burned in midair. Parachutes bloomed over Belgium like white blossoms of despair. That winter, weather grounded missions as often as it launched them. Crews waited in damp barracks, counting missions to reach the magic number that earned a rotation home. The ground shook whenever another fortress failed to return. At the same time, in Berlin, the Reich Air Ministry was growing anxious. The Allied raids were longer, deeper, more relentless. Factories in Bremen and Wilhelmshaven were taking heavy losses. Intercept squadrons were stretched thin. The Luftwaffe needed intelligence, something more than fragments, of wreckage retrieved from fields and forests. And then came the report from France that a fortress had landed, intact. It was said to have limped across the channel, with smoke trailing from its No. 3 engine. The crew had vanished, some dead, some captured, some missing. But the machine remained. The Germans had seen downed B-17s before, but never one this complete. Its electrical systems were still functional, its defensive guns still loaded. To the Luftwaffe, this was a gift from the heavens, or perhaps, they joked darkly, from Satan himself. The order came swiftly: secure it, study it, learn everything possible. At Leeuwarden Airfield, technicians were summoned from Rechlin, Germany's primary test center. Officers from Jagdgeschwader 26, the famed Abbeville boys, were told to stand by. Even engineers from Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf arrived, armed with notebooks and measuring tools. When the tarpaulin was pulled back, the Germans stood in silence. They had seen the fortress only from gun sights, from the brief blur of aluminum that streaked past before disappearing in smoke. Now it stood before them like a wounded colossus, an artifact of American industry, brutal and beautiful. Its machine guns were massive, mounted in every direction. Ammunition belts looped like steel snakes through narrow corridors. The bomb bay doors hung open, revealing the black cavity that had once carried destruction across the continent. The officers circled it with cautious reverence. They noted the markings, the reinforced glass, the complexity of the radio systems. Everything about it spoke of one thing: power. Drexler and his comrades had fought against these machines. They had seen friends vanish into flaming spirals because of them. Now they could walk its catwalks, touch its cold aluminum ribs, smell the mix of oil, sweat, and fear that still clung to the metal. A strange question began to form among them. Not just how it flew, but how men fought inside it. What drove 10 airmen to climb aboard such a fortress and face the sky knowing the odds? The answers, they believed, lay within the machine itself. That was how the study began, quietly, methodically, beneath the gray northern sky. The first notes would later reach Berlin within days. But before those reports could be written, one more thing had to happen. The story of how this particular B-17 came to rest on German soil. That story began a week earlier, high above the coast of Holland, January 10, 1943. The 91st Bomb Group lifted off from Bassingbourn, England, before dawn. Engines thundered across the Cambridgeshire fields as 48 B-17s formed in disciplined rectangles of silver. The target, submarine pens at Lorient on the French coast. Heavy flak was expected, and intelligence warned of new German fighter patrols in the region. Aboard one of those bombers, the B-17F Wolfhound, 10 crewmen prepared for the long flight. She was a veteran ship of many missions, patched and scarred from earlier runs. Captain William DuPont, 24, from Illinois, commanded her. He trusted the aircraft more than he trusted luck. His gunners, hardened and sleepless, ran their final checks. Waist guns charged, turret motors spinning, oxygen lines clear. Frost formed on their masks before takeoff. At 08:30 hours, the formation crossed the French coast. Flak erupted immediately, black blossoms tearing the sky apart. The fortress shuddered under the concussions. Wolfhound took a hit in her No. 3 engine, which began to cough smoke. DuPont held course. Losing position meant death. The bomb run went as planned. The payload dropped cleanly over Lorient's docks. But turning for home, the fortresses met what the crews called the Black Swarm. Dozens of Focke-Wulf 190s came diving out of the sun. The air turned into a furnace of tracer fire and twisting metal. Gunners fired until their barrels glowed. For 30 minutes, chaos ruled the formation. Radio chatter was useless. Just screams, static, and call signs vanishing mid-sentence. Wolfhound was hit again, this time in the starboard wing. Hydraulic pressure failed. One waist gunner, Sergeant Loudon, was killed instantly. Another slumped unconscious from lack of oxygen. Still, DuPont refused to abandon ship. He leveled out, limping north, losing altitude by the minute. The nearest friendly territory was still 100 miles away. England was beyond reach. The second engine began to overheat. By 10:20 hours, the bomber was drifting toward the Dutch coast at barely 1,000 feet. German flak towers tracked it silently but did not fire. Perhaps they thought it was already finished. Inside the radio compartment, Sergeant Kessler sent a final transmission. Going down near IJsselmeer. Crew bailing, but not all bailed. The pilot and co-pilot stayed, fighting the controls as long as the fortress held together. Witnesses on the ground, Dutch farmers under occupation, later reported the great aircraft descending with eerie calm, one wheel half lowered, its props windmilling. It touched down roughly on a frozen field near Leeuwarden. German soldiers arrived within the hour. They found 2 dead, 4 wounded, and the rest missing, either escaped or hiding. The aircraft itself, astonishingly, was intact. The next day, Luftwaffe engineers arrived under guard. The Black Cross was painted over the American star. Orders came from Berlin. Do not dismantle. Instead, repair it, study it, fly it. So began one of the most unusual test operations of the war. The Rechlin Experimental Institute dispatched experts to evaluate the captured fortress. They replaced damaged engines, patched the skin with German alloy, and rearmed the turrets for demonstrations. Inside, notebooks filled with diagrams of every gun position, every control linkage, every armor plate. When Major Wolfgang Balthasar, a former ace, first sat in the pilot's seat, he ran his hand along the yoke and muttered, "It feels American, solid, stubborn." He meant it as both insult and admiration. Within weeks, the captured B-17 flew again, under German command. Its engines roared over occupied Europe, bearing Luftwaffe markings. while American radar operators below wondered how one of their own could be flying the wrong direction. For the officers observing from the ground, it was more than curiosity. It was revelation. They were not just learning about an enemy airplane. They were studying a philosophy of war, and as they examined its gun mounts and armor, they began to understand why so many German fighters never returned from their attacks. That realization would spark debates, rivalries, and finally, confessions among the Luftwaffe's highest officers. Confessions that would later echo through history. Those confessions began in the hangar. As the officers watched the captured B-17 taxi for its first German test flight, the human angle. When the captured B-17, by then nicknamed Dornröschen, Sleeping Beauty by its new caretakers, rolled out of the hangar, it drew silent crowds. Mechanics, pilots, and even local villagers came to stare. To the Germans, this was no longer just a machine. It was the enemy itself, lying docile under their command. Oberleutnant Karl Drexler stood near the wing, hands deep in his greatcoat pockets, staring at the row of gun barrels. He had flown against these bombers for months. He had seen them burn, seen their crews tumble through clouds like broken dolls. Yet walking through the waist section of this one, he felt something different. Respect, maybe even pity. Inside the narrow fuselage, the smell of burnt cordite still lingered. He could imagine the men who had fought here, the sweat on the gun grips, the freezing air rushing through bullet holes, the shouts over the intercom. Each gun position felt like a small battlefield. When Drexler ducked beneath the radio compartment doorway, his boot brushed something wedged under a seat, a photograph. It was cracked and wet from condensation. 10 young men smiling beside the same aircraft weeks before, all wearing leather jackets and wide grins. Someone had written on the back in pencil, "Till it's over." Drexler stared at it for a long moment before pocketing it. Later, he would claim he kept it for intelligence purposes. But he knew it wasn't true. That human ghost inside the metal hull haunted every German who touched the plane. Engineers moved around the interior carefully, as if they were disturbing a grave. Every detail, the worn throttle grips, the scratched dials, the frozen blood on the floor, spoke of the men who had fought and died there, and that quiet human presence began to alter something in them. The machine wasn't just an enemy artifact. It was a message from the other side of the sky. The overlapping cones of fire from tail, waist, and dorsal turrets created what pilots called the wall of lead. Even the veteran aces hesitated to cross it. The captured B-17 now gave them the opportunity to see why. In a hangar at Rechlin, engineers mapped the angles of every gun. They discovered that the fortress could project defensive fire in nearly 360 degrees, with only one vulnerable zone, directly beneath the nose. Even there, the belly turret offered partial cover. The Germans had been flying straight into their own deaths. Flight instructors adjusted training programs overnight. They ordered new maneuvers, head-on attacks at oblique angles, synchronized bursts from multiple fighters to overwhelm a single bomber's gunners. Squadrons practiced formations designed to exploit the narrowest gaps. But something else became clear during the tests. Even when damaged, the B-17 refused to die easily. Its redundant systems, heavy armor, and compartmentalized design allowed it to limp home with astonishing resilience. One engineer summarized it bluntly in his report to Berlin. "It is a flying fortress in truth, not in name. It demands respect." This captured fortress reshaped the Luftwaffe's doctrine. For the first time, their strategists admitted that the war in the air had shifted balance, not in numbers, but in philosophy. The Americans built aircraft to endure. The Germans built aircraft to perform. The revelation forced them to question which mattered more in a war of attrition: the technological angle in the freezing air of the hangar. Test pilot Major Wolfgang Balthasar settled into the B-17's cockpit for the first evaluation flight. The seat felt enormous, designed for comfort during long hours in the sky. The control layout was foreign yet intuitive. The Americans, he realized, had built their aircraft around human endurance, not just mechanical efficiency. He powered up the engines one by one. The rhythmic rumble shook frost from the roof beams. Instruments glowed softly in English markings. As the throttles advanced, The four Wright Cyclone engines blended into a low, steady roar. It was a sound different from any German bomber. Deep, patient, confident. Technicians noted every vibration, every torque reaction. The Fortress rolled forward smoothly, heavy but obedient. In flight, its stability stunned the observers. Even with partial flaps frozen and one engine slightly misaligned, it held formation effortlessly. When Balthazar landed and stepped out, his face was pale from cold and disbelief. "It is no wonder," he said quietly, "that our fighters cannot break their lines." Inside the aircraft, the engineers discovered power-operated gun turrets that responded with remarkable precision. The twin Browning 50 calibers could sweep wide arcs, controlled by simple hand grips and foot pedals. German analysts compared them to their own MG-81 systems, lighter, faster, but less stable under recoil. The Fortress carried more ammunition than any bomber they had seen. Each gun was fed by belts hundreds of rounds long, with quick-change boxes and de-icing vents to prevent jamming. In one report, a Luftwaffe technician wrote, "This aircraft is not built merely to drop bombs. It is built to fight its way to the target and back." That line circulated quietly through staff offices across occupied Europe, and when it reached the desks of high-ranking officers in Berlin, it provoked a single unsettling question. If the Americans could build thousands of these machines, could Germany survive the sky? That thought lingered like a shadow, even as the study continued. The more they learned, the more they realized the Fortress wasn't just a machine. It was a symbol of a nation's will to overwhelm by endurance and firepower combined. It was a philosophy of war written in aluminum and gunpowder, and it was about to challenge everything the Luftwaffe believed about air. Superiority, the leadership and command angle. The captured Fortress soon became more than a technical curiosity. It became a political object. Within weeks, high-ranking officers from Berlin arrived at Leeuwarden. Among them was General Lieutenant Adolf Galland, Inspector of Fighters, his uniform immaculate, cigarette clenched between two fingers. He had heard of the B-17 from his pilot's reports. The flying porcupine, bristling with guns, nearly impossible to bring down without heavy losses. Now, for the first time, he would see one up close. He walked around the aircraft slowly, trailing smoke, his boots crunching frost. The officers followed at a respectful distance. "So," Galland murmured, running his hand across the patched fuselage, "this is what bleeds us in the daylight." He climbed the ladder into the cockpit and sat in the pilot's chair. It was built like a fortress within a fortress. Thick glass, armored plates behind the seats, backup gauges for almost every system. Galen noted the ergonomic placement of switches, the visibility from the canopy, the redundancies in fuel and hydraulics. Everything spoke of meticulous engineering. He turned to Drexler, standing at attention behind him. "This is not luck," Galland said. "It's design. Every man who flies this has a chance to live. That changes how he fights." That line echoed through the command echelons. The Luftwaffe had always prized agility, speed, and aggression, qualities that favored the daring ace, not the long-surviving crew. The Americans, Galland realized, were waging a different kind of war. They built systems that multiplied survival. They fought by mathematics, by endurance, by industrial weight. The captured B-17 became a mirror, showing German commanders not what they wanted to see, but what they had ignored, that the Reich could not sustain a war of attrition against a nation that built safety as a weapon. Within weeks, the findings were forwarded to the Reich Air Ministry. Recommendations followed: stronger defensive armament for German bombers, reinforced pilot armor, larger escort formations, but it was too late. The factories were already strained, the fuel shortages deepening, and the war had shifted beyond recovery. The officers at Leeuwarden didn't know it, but the seeds of Luftwaffe decline were already sown in the shadow of that silver aircraft, the enemy morale and propaganda angle. When word spread that a captured B-17 was flying under German colors, propaganda officers moved quickly. They saw opportunity. Photographs were taken. Officers posing beside the bomber with its new markings. Ground crews pretending to load bombs. Articles appeared in Luftwaffe field journals, describing the weakness of American bombers and German, mastery over enemy technology. But those who had seen the fortress close knew the truth. The plane was anything but weak. During its first test flight in Luftwaffe service, the aircraft performed flawlessly. Cameras captured it soaring above the gray North Sea, its engines humming evenly, its new crosses gleaming against the dull winter sky. For a moment, even the propaganda men forgot their script. Inside the intelligence division, analysts drafted internal memoranda warning that morale among fighter units was slipping. Pilots returning from sorties against bomber formations increasingly described the missions as suicidal. They had seen comrades vanish in flashes of gunfire before reaching firing range. The B-17's defensive network, especially when multiplied across hundreds of bombers, was devastatingly efficient. Some pilots began referring to them bitterly as Die Fliegende. Wandes, the flying wall, the captured fortress was meant to restore confidence. Instead, it deepened doubt. Once Luftwaffe officers saw the sheer durability of the American machine, the heavy armor, the redundancy, the accuracy of its gunnery, they began to question whether German industry could ever match it. Even the propaganda photographs betrayed an unspoken irony. The black crosses painted over the American stars looked crude, temporary, like graffiti on a cathedral. One German officer later wrote in his diary, "We tried to make it ours, but it remained theirs. Every rivet, every gun mount, every wire spoke in an American accent. The plane that was supposed to symbolize triumph became a quiet reminder of technological and industrial inferiority. It flew in demonstrations escorted by German fighters for safety, but never saw combat under its new insignia. The risk of being shot down by its own side was too great. Still, its legend spread. Allied intelligence eventually learned that the Germans had a working B-17. American briefings warned air crews, "If you see a fortress firing tracers of the wrong color, don't hesitate. In the fog of war, friend and foe could blur for a second too long. That single moment of hesitation could mean death." The moral and psychological angle, for those who worked around it daily, the captured B-17 provoked a kind of moral unease. It was one thing to destroy the enemy, another to inhabit his machine, to study his craftsmanship, to admire his courage. The more they touched it, the more human the enemy became. Oberleutnant Drexler wrote in a letter never mailed, "Every switch, every worn handle inside this aircraft tells me that someone built it to save lives, not to take them. Kills, yes, but it protects too. I wonder if that is what separates us now." Among the engineers, quiet debates began. How did the Americans produce such reliability, such abundance? Why could they afford to build 10 of these for everyone, Heinkel or Dornier? The answer was as clear as it was painful. Industrial democracy, vast resources, relentless innovation. For a few, the study of the B-17 became a lesson in humility. They saw in it the reflection of a world Germany could no longer reach. A world of factories running at full capacity, of engineers free to innovate without fear, of crews who believed they were fighting for something beyond orders. And though the officers would never admit it aloud, some began to feel envy. The fortress had shown them a truth that no doctrine could deny, that war was no longer decided solely by bravery, but by the system that nurtured it. By the spring of 1943, Dornröschen stood idle again, grounded by lack of spare parts. But the officers who had studied it would carry its lessons into every sortie that followed. And soon, those lessons would collide violently with reality, when the Luftwaffe faced not one captured fortress, but a sky filled with thousands. That reckoning would come in the months ahead, when the balance of the air war finally shifted forever, and it would begin fittingly, with the roar of engines over Schweinfurt and Regensburg, August 17, 1943, dawn over western Germany. The day began with the faint tremor of distant thunder, though the skies were clear. It wasn't weather, it was engines, hundreds of them. From the control tower at Leeuwarden, Oberleutnant Karl Drexler stood beside Major Balthazar and watched the reports flood in. Radar stations along the coast were screaming. The Americans were coming in force, 2 massive bomber streams, converging over the Reich. The largest daylight assault in history, Schweinfurt, Regensburg. Those names would soon be etched into every German pilot's memory. For months, the Luftwaffe had prepared. They had studied, trained, and adjusted tactics, many inspired by the lessons learned from the captured fortress, Dornröschen. The intelligence briefings predicted that the B-17s could not sustain heavy losses and still continued deep penetration raids. One decisive counterblow could break their confidence, maybe even halt the daylight offensive entirely. But no briefing could prepare them for what they saw that morning. At 0900 hours, the first contrails appeared, faint lines scratching across the high blue. Then came the formation, block after block of silver shapes glinting in the sun, tight and perfect, flying as if welded together. The air hummed with a mechanical chorus, the sound of 376 bombers climbing in unison, escorted by P-47 Thunderbolts that darted above like hawks. Drexler watched, frozen. He had walked through one of those machines, touched its cold armor, smelled the oil in its engines. Now he saw hundreds of them moving as one living organism. "Mein Gott," whispered a ground officer. "There are too many." From every airfield across northern Germany, fighters scrambled. Bf-109s, FW-190s, Me-410s, everything that could fly. The air war erupted in full daylight. By 0925, the first wave of German interceptors met the bomber stream west of Aachen. The radio filled with clipped commands, screams, static. The sky turned into a boiling cauldron of smoke and tracer fire. And above it all, the fortresses held their shape. From the ground, they looked slow and steady, but inside those ships was chaos. Gunners shouted bearings, smoke filled the turrets, oxygen masks froze to skin, yet the formations didn't break. It was the very thing Drexler had seen inside Dornröschen, the defensive matrix made real. A fortress multiplied 100-fold. Major Balthazar leaned toward the window, eyes narrowed. "They learned from us," he said grimly. "But we learned from them first." He was right. The Luftwaffe attacks came from the front, just as the Rechlin studies had recommended. Head-on passes at closing speeds over 600 miles per hour. It was suicidal precision. For a few minutes it worked. B-17s exploded mid-air, fragments raining down like burning hail. Entire formations shifted, struggling to close gaps before another attack wave hit. But the bombers kept coming. The gaps closed again, the sky filled with tracer arcs, shimmering like ribbons of light. One German pilot described it later as flying into a wall of fire that moved and breathed. Inside the German control room, Drexler watched the battle unfold through the tracking boards. Colored pins marked fighter groups, red markers for confirmed losses. The pattern was grim. For every bomber destroyed, 2 German interceptors failed to return. By 1100 hours, the first reports from Schweinfurt came through. Bombs hitting ball-bearing factories, flames consuming entire industrial blocks. Regensburg soon followed. The sound of explosions drifted faintly across the radio lines, almost like thunder on the horizon. When Dornröschen had first been captured, it was a symbol of German ingenuity, a chance to reverse engineer victory. Now, standing in that tower, Drexler realized it had also been a warning, one they hadn't fully understood. Because what they saw over Schweinfurt wasn't just machinery. It was industrial power turned into a weapon of endurance, and endurance was something Germany was rapidly running out of. At 1300 hours, Gallen's headquarters issued new orders. Pull the fighters back. Fuel reserves were dangerously low. The bombers were still advancing. The sky was filled with smoke, debris, and falling parachutes. It was a vision of apocalypse, sunlight fractured by flak bursts, engines flaming as they spun toward Earth. In that inferno, both sides learned something brutal. The war in the air was no longer about who flew better. It was about who could outlast the other. When the last formation disappeared westward toward the channel, the silence was unbearable. Drexler removed his headset and looked at the sky, now empty except for drifting ash. He thought of the photograph still in his pocket, the smiling American crew of Wolfhound. He wondered if men like them were up there still, or if they too were burning somewhere beyond the clouds. That night, the test hangar at Leeuwarden remained dark. The captured fortress stood alone under a tarpaulin, its engines cold. It had served its purpose. It had shown the Germans everything, including their own limits. But the lesson was not over yet. Because the next morning, new orders arrived from Berlin. Dornröschen will fly once more, under test conditions, to evaluate defensive firing arcs during simulated intercepts, and that final flight would reveal the most haunting truth of all. August 19th, 1943, 2 days after the inferno of Schweinfurt-Regensburg. The airfield at Leeuwarden was strangely quiet. The mechanics moved like ghosts, eyes red from sleepless nights. The hangar doors creaked open to reveal Dornröschen, the captured B-17F, her silver skin patched with German markings, her wings streaked with oil and soot. Oberleutnant Karl Drexler walked toward it with a mixture of reverence and dread. The war had changed in 48 hours. The Luftwaffe's confidence, so bright, so sure, now trembled under the weight of reality. Over 300 German fighters had been lost. The Americans had lost bombers, yes, but their offensive continued. The sky itself seemed to belong to them now. The order from Berlin was simple. Dornröschen would fly a live simulation. 4 Focke-Wulf 190s would attack her from multiple directions to study the limits of her defensive arcs under real conditions. The crew were volunteers, 5 German officers who had trained on the aircraft for months. They knew every lever, every quirk of its systems. At Autun, the engines started. The familiar deep rumble of 4 Wright Cyclones rolled across the field. It was the sound Drexler could never get used to, a sound too powerful, too foreign, too alive. He climbed aboard, taking the co-pilot's seat beside Major Balthazar. The aircraft trembled as it lifted off, wheels folding neatly beneath her belly. Below them, the coastline fell away, gray waves flashing beneath the wings. "Test range in 5 minutes," said Balthazar calmly through his headset. "Simulated attack pattern Delta." "Copy," replied Drexler, checking the instruments. From the gun stations, the German crew reported readiness. They had spent weeks studying American manuals, learning the rhythm of coordinated defensive fire. They admired it even as they prepared to destroy it. Then the attacks began. 4 black specks appeared on the horizon, Fu 190s diving fast, their wings glinting. The gunners tensed. A voice crackled in German, "Engaging from 2 o'clock high." The air filled with the chatter of machine guns. Brass casings clattered against the fuselage. The smell of gunpowder filled the oxygen masks. Tracer rounds stitched the sky like fiery seams. "Cease fire," shouted Drexler. "Too close." The 190s broke off, trailing smoke. They weren't hit, but they were shaken. Even in simulation, the defensive wall of the fortress was overwhelming. The combined firepower from 1050 caliber Browning guns created a moving storm of lead that no pilot could cross safely. The test continued. Attack after attack, angle after angle, from above, below, head on. Every pass ended the same way. Gunners firing in overlapping arcs, emptying belts into the air with mechanical precision. The fighters couldn't get within 300 meters before their attack vectors were filled with death. By noon, the test was over. The aircraft returned to base. The hangar was silent as the officers gathered around the results table. The data sheets were clear. In almost every engagement profile, the attacking fighters had less than 5 seconds of survivable exposure time. 5 seconds before being torn apart, Major Balthazar removed his flight cap, exhaling. "This machine," he said quietly, "is not just an airplane. It's an idea. Fortress in the air." He paused, glancing at Drexler. "But it is also a warning. No nation can sustain this level of defense forever. It will devour itself in time." That night, a report was sent to Berlin. It concluded that the B-17's defensive design represented a near-perfect union of endurance, coordination, and mechanical reliability, but also noted its weaknesses: high fuel consumption, vulnerability to concentrated frontal attacks, and fatigue of crews under sustained fire. Still, there was an unspoken truth beneath the ink: respect. Drexler lingered in the hangar long after the others had left. He walked along the wings, running his hand across the rivets. He imagined the American crew who had once sat here, the pilot gripping the yoke through flak bursts, the waist gunners shouting bearings, the radio operator whispering a prayer. He could almost hear them in the silence, and for the first time, He understood something the reports could not measure. The power of the B-17 wasn't in its guns. It was in its people, men who flew through hell at 25,000 feet, knowing half would never return. Yet still they climbed back into those machines the next morning. That realization would spread quietly among the Luftwaffe officers who flew her. Some even admitted it years later after the war, that in Dornröschen, they saw not just American engineering, but American resolve. In a 1956 interview, Drexler summarized it best. We had flown the fortress. We had tested its defenses. We had written its weaknesses in our reports. But we also knew it was not a machine that frightened us. It was the spirit inside it. That spirit, by the winter of 1943, would begin to turn the tide of the air war. Because for every fortress that fell, 2 more would take its place. And for every German pilot who saw one burning, the memory would linger, not as a victory, but as a haunting question. How do you defeat something that refuses to break? The answer would come in the months that followed, in the ashes of Berlin and the ruins of the Reich. But first came the reckoning. The Allied bombers were no longer a threat. They were a storm, and Germany, for all its science and courage, was standing in the path of that storm. Next came the silence after impact, the aftermath of the Fortress War. By early 1944, the shape of the air war had changed forever. The lessons drawn from Dornröschen, the captured B-17, had given the Luftwaffe valuable insight. But insight could not replace numbers, fuel, or pilots. Germany's air force was bleeding out faster than its factories could recover. The reports from the Schweinfurt-Regensburg raid told a grim paradox. The Americans had lost 60 bombers, over 600 men. Yet production in the U.S. replaced them in weeks. The Luftwaffe, however, had lost more than 300 fighters and dozens of experienced airmen. Losses that could never be fully replaced. It wasn't just about machines anymore. It was about endurance. When Dornröschen had flown her last test flight in late August, she was quietly grounded, her engines removed for parts, her frame used for gunnery drills. To most German officers, she had become a relic, a ghost of an enemy that no longer seemed defeatable. But for men like Oberleutnant Karl Drexler, she was a symbol, the turning of the tide. The moment they realized that the enemy's strength came from something deeper than steel. By the winter of 1943-44, Allied bombers filled the skies almost daily. Their formations grew larger, tighter, more confident. The once clear German mornings now began with the wail of sirens. Factories in Bremen, Hamburg, and Kassel burned for days. Rail lines were torn apart. Ball-bearing production, once the pride of Schweinfurt, fell to a fraction of its pre-war output. Even the oil refineries, lifeblood of the Luftwaffe, were turned into smoldering craters. Inside command bunkers, Luftwaffe staff tried to adapt. They designed new intercept tactics, faster fighters, and heavier armament. The Me-262 jet was on the horizon, sleek, powerful, revolutionary. But there were too few of them, too late. And above it all, the bombers kept coming. Every pilot who had flown Dornröschen now carried a strange respect for those silver machines. They had tested her defenses, admired her engineering, and felt her raw endurance firsthand. Many Luftwaffe officers later admitted that when they faced real B-17 formations again, they could almost predict every turret's movement, and still it made no difference. Because by now, the sky itself belonged to the Allies. Drexler, now grounded due to injury, was assigned to analyze combat footage from the front lines. Day after day, he watched film reels of intercept missions, flickering images of German fighters diving into walls of tracer fire. He recognized the same patterns, the same arcs he'd studied in Dornröschen. Except now, there was something else in the footage. American escort fighters. P-47s, P-51 Mustangs. They hunted in pairs, slashing through German formations before the bombers even arrived. The old equations no longer applied. The walls of defense that once protected the Reich were gone. By May 1944, the statistics were undeniable. German aircraft production was up, yes, but the pilots were gone. The Luftwaffe's average flight experience had dropped from 240 combat hours in 1942 to less than 50. In contrast, American bomber crews trained for 400 hours before seeing combat. Their tactics were rehearsed, drilled, perfected. Every fortress in the sky was a moving piece in an enormous synchronized machine. Drexler once wrote in his diary, "We used to believe courage was enough. But courage without continuity is suicide." They had both. The captured fortress had shown them the blueprint of resilience, but the Reich could not build its own. As 1944 turned to 1945, the bombing campaigns reached their final crescendo. The Allied air fleets numbered in the thousands. Cities vanished under clouds of fire, and somewhere, under the collapsed hangars of Leeuwarden, the remains of Dornröschen lay buried in dust, a silent monument to a truth the Luftwaffe had learned too late. The fortress could be shot down, but its idea could not. That idea of endurance through unity was now rewriting the outcome of the war, and soon it would reach its most devastating conclusion. Spring 1945. The skies over Germany no longer held battles, only consequences. The endless waves of American B-17s and B-24s now flew almost unopposed, their contrails stretching across the heavens like chalk lines over a broken land. Where once stood factories and airfields, there were only craters. Towns once filled with workers now lay silent, reduced to ash and dust. The Luftwaffe, once the pride of the Reich, existed now only in fragments, pockets of resistance scattered across ruined airstrips. The few remaining pilots were boys, barely trained, sent into the air with trembling hands. Their commanders knew the truth. There was no longer a defense to be made. Inside a small operations bunker outside Bremen, Oberleutnant Karl Drexler listened to the faint rumble of engines far above. It was a sound he could recognize even in his sleep, the rhythm of the fortress. The same steady heartbeat that had haunted him since the day he first touched Dornröschen's cold fuselage. He stepped outside. The sky was gray, streaked with trails of exhaust. Dozens of fortresses passed overhead, flying in perfect boxes, their bellies opening in unison. The earth trembled as bombs fell in waves, shaking the foundations of everything he once believed indestructible. To many Germans below, the bombers were monsters, faceless machines of destruction. But to Drexler they were something more complex. He no longer saw enemies. He saw endurance made visible, the very thing his own nation had tried to imitate when it flew that captured B-17. Now he understood. They had not captured an aircraft. They had captured a reflection of what they lacked, the relentless will to continue, even through loss, even through fire. The reports arriving from Berlin grew shorter, more desperate. Fuel stocks gone, ammunition gone, airfields destroyed, command fragmented. Even Adolf Galland, once the symbol of German aerial mastery, admitted defeat. In his post-war memoir, he wrote, "We fought the fortresses as best as we could. We struck them, we studied them, we feared them. But in the end, we learned that courage without resources is futility." By April, the war was collapsing. American bombers no longer had to fight their way in. They simply arrived. The Reich's heart was laid bare. Leeuwarden, the airfield where Dornröschen had once flown, was now abandoned. The hangars were empty, the runways cracked and overgrown. In one forgotten corner, under tarpaulin and dust, the shattered frame of the captured fortress still stood, its engines removed, its markings faded. A British recovery team would later find it there after the liberation. The aircraft was dismantled and transported back to England for study. In official RAF records, it appeared under a single quiet entry: recovered American aircraft, formerly used by Luftwaffe for evaluation. Codename Dornröschen, status scrapped. But its story didn't end there. For decades after the war, Allied veterans who had flown the Schweinfurt-Regensburg missions spoke about the moment they learned that the Germans had once flown one of their own fortresses. To them, it was almost unbelievable, the idea that their enemies had studied the very machine designed to destroy them. And yet, it made sense. The B-17 was more than a tool of war. It was a philosophy, one built on collaboration, precision, and belief in the power of endurance. For the Luftwaffe, Dornröschen became a haunting echo of what might have been. If only they had more time, more fuel, more faith in something beyond victory. For the Allies, It became proof that even their enemies could not help but admire what the fortress represented. When Karl Drexler was interviewed years later, he spoke softly about that final flight. "We did not lose to the machine," he said. "We lost to the men inside it, and to the idea that built it. No bullet could bring that down." By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, the world's skies had been remade. The fortress had done what it was built to do: defend not only its crew, but an entire belief that discipline, unity, and courage could turn mortal men into something unbreakable. And for those who had flown Dornröschen, its ghost never truly left the air, because every time they heard engines thunder in formation, they remembered that cold morning in 1943, the day they realized they were no longer the hunters. They had become the haunted. The war ended, but its echoes lingered, in wreckage, in memory, and in the silent bones of machines that once ruled the sky. Among those echoes, one story remained half forgotten: the tale of Dornröschen, the sleeping beauty of the Luftwaffe. It began as a trophy, a captured American B-17, dissected for secrets. It ended as a mirror, reflecting back to its captors the truth they least wanted to see: that technology alone cannot save a nation when conviction has rotted from within. When German engineers first stepped inside the fortress, they saw machinery, but what they failed to grasp was that every bolt, every turret, every rivet was built around one human idea: collective endurance. It was not one pilot, one gunner, or one commander who made it powerful. It was the orchestra of 10 men moving as one, believing in something larger than themselves. That was what Drexler came to understand as the smoke cleared over Europe. The air war was not just a contest of engines and altitude. It was a test of spirit. The Allies built machines to protect life. The Reich built machines to destroy. The difference, invisible on blueprints, was decisive in the air. When Dornröschen finally vanished into the scrap yards of history, its fragments were scattered. A wing here, a gun mount there, yet its lesson endured. Every future aircraft, every bomber, every strategy of air defense carried traces of what the Germans had learned from that single, captured machine. But beyond blueprints and tactics, Dornröschen left a moral imprint. It reminded both sides that even in war, respect can exist. The respect one soldier feels for another's courage, the quiet understanding that valor knows no flag. In the end, Dornröschen was never truly German or American. It was a teacher, a cold, metallic truth forged in the crucible of human conflict. It taught that no empire can endure on arrogance alone. It taught that unity, discipline, and moral conviction are the strongest armor any crew can wear. And it whispered one final lesson across the decades: machines fight wars, but men, and the beliefs that guide them, decide their outcome.